So in the first session, we covered the 6 principles of soil health. In this session, we're going to dive a little deeper, and we're going to go into, and we're getting into more specifics. But it is critical, just like in the first session, we covered those 6 principles. It's really critical to have a core understanding of those 6 principles that we covered in the first hour and a half. So, adaptive stewardship. Now, we hear this term all the time, and we just were talking about it. Regenerative, right? What in the heck does it mean? And we already know that there are companies and so forth out there that are trying to preempt this and use it for marketing purposes and so on and so forth. That's inevitable. That's inevitable. But this, we live it, breathe it, sleep it every day. This is what we do. We know what regenerative is. And this is our definition of regenerative agriculture. It is farming and ranching in synchrony with nature and the 4 ecosystem processes to repair, rebuild, revitalize, and restore ecosystem function, starting with life beneath the soil and expanding to life above. Okay? That's what regenerative agriculture is. It's nothing else. Any other definition is incorrect, and I'm just going to stand by that, folks, okay, very solidly. Any other definition would be incorrect because, again, we live it, breathe it, sleep it every darn day. We know what we see. We know what we're observing on thousands of farms and ranches all over the world. So we use the 6 principles, that I covered in the first session and the 3 rules that I'm going to cover this session to adequately and accurately implement regenerative agriculture. Now, I love this quote by W.C. Loudermilk in his book, Conquest of the Land Through 7,000 Years. Loudermilk says that the land does not lie. It bears a record of what men write on it, a record that is easy to read by those who understand the simple language of the land. So, folks, bottom line, our management is written on the tapestry of the land. The land does not lie. It's a testament to what we've done, good or bad. And we use this quote by Don Campbell quite often. And I mentioned it in the earlier session, but if you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. But if you want to make major changes, you have to change the way you see things. Now, we have farms and ranches ourselves in Mississippi and Alabama, so that's where we're located. At our Alabama farm, this is our crew there, and that team, those people you see there, are the reason I can be here, or the reason I can be somewhere in Canada or somewhere in some other country. Those are the people I rely on a day-in, day-out basis. They know their jobs, they perform them very well, they're proud of what they do, they take pride in being regenerative farmers and ranchers. They love it. They love it. And as I said earlier, regenerative agriculture is a thinking person's game. Okay? You're not going to sleep your way through this. It is truly a thinking person's game. Everybody you see on that screen there, they think every day about what they're doing. They make observations every day about what they're doing, and then they come back and tell me, hey, Alan, I saw this or I saw that. And, you know, I mean, just every day they're thinking and making corrections and little changes and improvements. on what's going on. But they can only do that because they're spending a lot of time in observation every single day. And we give them that time. As a matter of fact, we heavily encourage that. What I don't want any member of our team doing there on the farm is I don't want them having this checklist of tasks every day that just check, 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 done, good, feel great about myself. What we tell them is take time every day to observe, slow down, look at things. We're not going to jump all over you because we see you standing there or sitting in a buggy looking at something. That's what I want them doing, okay? Because then they'll do every other task better, a lot better. So that's what we encourage everybody to do. So that's our team. Like I said, I'm very proud of them, or at least our team on the Alabama farm, on Mississippi farm. We've got a similar team. And make no mistake about it, the first group, I told them a little bit about my history. Born and raised on my family's farm here in South Carolina. But I farm and ranch in Mississippi now. My family's still here in South Carolina on the original farm. They've had that since 1840, so we got a long heritage there. But, and I spent the 15 years in academia as well. I was a professor and researcher and all of that. But what I want you to understand, we do what we can do not because we know something somebody else doesn't, not because we're smarter than anybody, not because we're more intelligent than anybody. We're not, and I'm certainly not, okay? We're able to achieve what we achieve because we spend time in observation and paying attention to what nature is telling us, what biology is telling us, and then responding accordingly. As a matter of fact, I'll relate this story to you to show you just how smart I am not, okay? When I was in high school, I came home at the end of one semester, and, back then, for you folks that are a lot younger, back then they actually gave you a report card on paper, okay? If you're too young today, you've never known a report card on paper, but they actually handed us a report card on cardstock to carry home with us. And so I had that in my hand, and walked in the house there, and my dad just happened to be in his easy chair in the den there when I got home, and he said, "Son, what you got in your hand?" And I said, and I wasn't proud of it at all. I said, "It's my report card." And he said, "Well, let me see that." So I said, "Yes, sir." And I sort of shuffled over to him, my head down, and sort of tossed it in his lap there. And he looked at it, and he said, "My goodness, son," he said, 3 F's and a D, what in the world has happened with you? And I said, "Dad, I don't know." I said, "I think I spent too much time in one subject, but then he said, "You know what, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to call the principal." So he picked up the phone, he called the school, he asked to speak to the principal. He said, "Look, this is Mr. Williams. I just got my son's report card." He said, "From the look of things here, it appears that my son doesn't know anything." And the principal said, "Well, Mr. Williams, I really hate to tell you this." He said, "But not only is it that your son doesn't know anything, but he doesn't even suspect anything." So, see, if I can do it, any of you can do this, okay? Very, very well. All right, so we do a lot of ranching and grass finishing and finish at scale. I'll show you some videos and stuff of moving grass fats and all of that. But for us, this is what it's all about. It's always centered around life. How can we create more life? Whereas in a lot of farming and ranching, we're thinking about how can I kill something? How can I kill that weed or that pest or whatever the case may be? But instead, for us, we're thinking about how can we create more and more and more life on our farms and ranches. And these insects, so all of these are photographs I've taken. These insects that you see are a key indicator species. So you want to know if you're being regenerative or not. Here's one of the ways that you know. If you're seeing an increase in your insect populations, in the species of insects that are there, you're making progress. You're being regenerative. Okay, so that's one of the key indicator species, is am I increasing my insect population? The second is birds. Birds are another key indicator species. If I'm seeing more and more birds in terms of population numbers and more different species of birds, then I know that I am being regenerative. I am improving my ecosystem function, because those beneficial insects and those birds are not going to be there if I'm not creating the environment, the habitat for them to be there. And the only way to create that habitat is to implement the regenerative practices. That's the way we do it. Now, in this video here, so I'm going to start it now, pay attention to all the birds that you're seeing there. Those are wood swallows, and actually there's also a lot of dragonflies in the mix there as well. Now, there are 700 head of cows in that video. This was August at our farm in Alabama, but you don't see 700 head of cows, do you? The grass was this tall, okay? So when we turned the 700 head of cows into that paddock, they just disappeared, okay, into the grass. So that's why you don't see 700 head there. But what I want to show you here with the birds and the dragonflies in that video, every time we move any of our livestock, we see many different species of birds, and these dragonflies and everything else just all of a sudden appear in large numbers. That's what you want to see. That's a good sign. That's indicative that you're doing something right. You're building a healthy ecosystem. And why are we seeing them? Why are they there? Why? What? Okay, because the insects are there. The cattle are stirring up insects. All right, Bruce, when you're done, you pick a hat. You come pick a hat or a book when we're done, okay? All right. So y'all will get a little reward if you answer questions right, okay? All right. Here's a new species of bird that showed up just this year at our Alabama farm. Does anybody know what that is? Swallowtail kite, okay? These have not been seen in our part of the country in a long, long time. And all of a sudden we have 4 mating pair that appeared on the farm and now live there, okay? Why? Because the habitat, we created the habitat for them to find us and to show up and to now live there and reproduce there. So we get excited when we look for things like this. We get excited when we see things like this starting to show up. We do a lot of pastured pig production as well, along with the grass-fed beef. I love pigs. Pigs have a tremendous personality, particularly pigs out on pasture. And pigs are wonderful grazers if we give them the opportunity to be. So we move pigs every day just like we do cattle under a single strand of polywire. They respond very well to polywire. They're averse to electricity, especially with that wet snout and all that. Boy, they learn about electric fencing real quick and avoid it. So we don't have the rooting and all of that people think you got to have with pigs, because we move them every day. And they'll forage very readily if you move them every day. This is some of our pastured pork. We get our pigs up to about 300 pounds, 320 pounds before we harvest them. We like a big pig. We like a lot of marbling in them. Pork is not supposed to be the other white meat. Okay? It is not. So that advertisement by national pork producers, no. Why are you claiming that? Pork is supposed to be like beef, cherry red, marbled, deep, richly flavored, not bland. That's what we're creating, real pork. We sell to a lot of restaurants, a lot of fine dining restaurants, a lot of James Beard award-winning chefs. This is the kind of pork they love. They don't want commodity pork. They like this because it's deeply, richly flavored and heavily marbled. Do a lot of pastured lamb. All hair sheep. Breeds that we typically use are Katahdin and Australian white crosses. That's sort of what we have settled in on. Don't take that to heart like that's the breeds you have to use. It's just what works for us in I talked a lot about context in the first session. That's what works in our context for us. We manage the sheep, just like we do the cattle and the pigs, under a single strand of polywire. Okay? So we've trained our sheep to respond and to move under a single strand of polywire. So it makes moving all of our livestock species really easy. There's nothing hard at all about doing this. We can move them on a daily basis very readily. We also do a lot of pastured egg and broiler production. We have different types of housing for our chickens. We also use guardian dogs. I mentioned this in the earlier session. You see two of our guardian dogs here. They live with the chickens 24/7, guard them from both, sharp-toothed predators and raptors. So we don't have raptor predation like from eagles or hawks, and we don't have sharp-tooth predation from coyotes, from bobcats, from fox, from raccoon, or anything like that. And we've got lots and lots and lots of all of those. Okay? We're a very rural area. I mean, in the evening, you can hear coyote packs everywhere singing, but they don't get our chickens because of these guardian dogs. So they do a great job of that. This is what our grass-fed beef looks like. We finish to a very high degree of finish on a year-round basis. We grade 90+% USDA choice and up. Typically, we'll hit 15% plus prime. On a lot of our grass-fed beef. So it's very well marbled, and it's very consistent. So this is what we put out and provide to our customer base, and that's 52 weeks out of the year. All right, so let's dive into adaptive stewardship. That's some of what we do personally, and now I'm going to talk to you through our consulting company, Understanding Ag, about what we do in terms of adaptive stewardship. So, first of all, we have to realize this. Nature will humble you, and if you refuse to be humbled, she's going to defeat you. You will never beat nature. As man, we have tried that for thousands of years. We have never won. And I don't know why we keep thinking we can somehow win. So why don't we work with nature rather than against her? Love this quote by Wendell Berry. How many know who Wendell Berry is? Okay, most of you, good. If you don't, you need to know who this man is. Wendell's in his 80s now, retired to his farm in Kentucky, but he's a world-renowned farmer, philosopher. This was from a 2018 New York Times op-ed by Wendell, where he says, agricultural choices must be made by these inescapable standards: the ecological health of the farm and the economic health of the farmer. Nothing could be more true. That's what it must be about for each of us if we want to be truly successful. And then Masanobu Fukuoka, how many know who he is? He's the author of One Straw Revolution. Masanobu is sort of like the Wendell Berry of Japan, okay? And he's in his 80s as well now. Masanobu says this: an object seen in isolation from the whole is not the real thing. This is a core mistake we have made in agricultural science, in agricultural practice, and even in medical research over the last several decades. We have boiled down our science, and I was guilty of this when I was in academia as well. We have boiled down our science to such a strict reductionist model, trying to view objects in isolation, thinking we're going to find the answer. That's a mistake. All we've succeeded in doing, and I'm saying this as a research scientist, okay? All we have succeeded in doing is creating Band-Aids to put on a gushing wound. The wound needs stitches, and we're putting Band-Aids on it. We're treating the symptoms and not the root cause. What we're talking about today is identifying and treating the root cause. That's how you make real profitability in agriculture. That's how you're able to pass down your farms and ranches from generation to generation. You're not going to do it the other way. You're going to struggle mightily, and you're going to always be mired in debt the other way. That's what we don't want to do. So we've got to quit viewing objects in isolation from the whole so that we can see the real thing. So one of the ways that we do that, we now view everything through the lens of what we call historical ecological perspective. What that means is this. Wherever we work in the U.S. or the world, we spend a lot of time in research going back and looking at what was that land like 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. What existed there? What grew there? What kind of variety was there? What happened there? What was the soil like? What was the soil biology like? What was the soil organic matter like? What was the depth of that horizon? We study all of that in detail. So we dig deep into archaeological research, into historical people's records, and so forth on any land. Early explorers, you name it, so that we can discover the historical ecological perspective. And the reason we spend that time doing that is because it's only if we can understand that we can then understand the potential for today. If we do not understand what that land once did and was capable of doing, we cannot begin to fathom now what that land can do once again if we apply the right principles and practices. So that's what we want to accomplish through this historical ecological perspective. So I'll give you an example. I live and farm in what is called the Black Belt Prairie. Historically, that was a prairie. Now today, for those of you that know the Black Belt, if you get outside of whatever is row cropped, what does it look like? Who said that? At the end, come get your book or hat. Okay? Right, forest. What does that forest look like? Yeah, well, too many pine trees, but what else? Is it thick? Okay, sort of thick, hard to walk through, all of that. Folks, that's not, we envision and we think that's what this country in the Deep South was like. No, it wasn't. How many know that we had bison here? Did y'all know that? We had bison here. Bison once existed from the Atlantic to the Pacific, south of the Arctic Circle down to the Gulf Coast, across the North American continent. Bison were never just a Western animal. And we had multiple species of bison. The only species we have left today is the bison, the plains bison. That's it. But we once had multiple species. As a matter of fact, the largest species of bison that existed in North America at one time existed here in the eastern portion of North America, and they stood more than 7 foot tall at the shoulder. They dwarfed a western bison, okay? They made them look tiny. So we once had some very large bison here. Did you know that elk existed from coast to coast at one time? Along with the deer. And antelope had a much broader range than they have today across the continental U.S. And they existed in massive numbers. So they exerted their influence. These original forests, so we had a mix in the southern U.S. The original mosaic of the southern U.S. was a patchwork of true prairie, tall grass native prairie that was actually more diverse than the Midwestern native prairie. We used to have more than 300 different plant species that existed here in the prairies of the South. Highly diverse. A mix of C3s, C4s, or cools and warm seasons, and biennials. That's what once was here. Okay, so it's only when we start understanding that we can then understand where we can bring it back to today. And it was incredibly productive, far, far more productive than it is today in terms of crops or anything else that we can grow here now. Then interspersed with that were the forests, but the forests were very different from what we see and envision today. These forests were not dense, thick, choked forests. They were very open. They were more savanna-like than what we think of as an eastern forest today. And how do we know that? Written recorded record, folks. Written recorded records. For one thing, the records of the early Spanish explorers, like Hernando de Soto. You know, when de Soto came through the deep south and landed in the Gulf Coast and made his way up through that loop in the south, that deep south, we know where his party was every day. We know how rapidly they traveled. He had a party of more than 600 men, many on horseback. They had supply wagons following along, and they had a herd of more than 500 pigs. So thank you, Hernando de Soto, for our wild pig problem today. He is the reason that we have all these wild pigs today, because some of them escaped, went feral, and we've had them ever since. Okay? So it's the Spaniards that created that problem for us originally. But we know where that party was every day. We know how rapidly they traveled, how big their party was. There is no way that if they had hit the South today and tried to move through the woods of today, they wouldn't have made a quarter a mile a day. Okay? They would have turned around, got back on their ships, went back to Spain, and told them over there, this is an impenetrable continent. But instead, it wasn't like that. And then the other two pieces of the mosaic, original mosaic, were the wetlands in the southeast. So we had the real prairie, of which the Black Belt Prairie was part of that. We had the savanna forest, and then we had the two types of wetlands. We had a grassed wetland, sort of a prairie-type wetland, and we had a savanna wetland, a wooded wetland. So those were the predominant types of ecosystems that once existed here and supported bison, elk, deer, antelope, all of those things. This is a recreation. Now granted, these trees are young. They're nothing like the massive pines that once grew here, okay? This is a recreation of a southeastern savanna. We also know that, so like where I live in the Black Belt Prairie, okay, of Alabama, Mississippi, when did the eastern folks migrate to there and start developing farms there and start putting the plow to the ground? When did they do that? So the folks from South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, when did they move to Alabama, the wilderness at that point of Alabama and Mississippi? The very, very early 1800s, okay? Now we have records of their wagon trains, yes, just like the Western wagon trains, they traveled in wagon trains from the Carolinas and Georgia and all of that across. They were moving through this, and we have records of them talking about recording moving through these savannas. It was easy for their wagon trains to travel through the woods. How many wagons you going to drive through a woods today? You know, it's not going to happen. So, again, very different. This is also a historical ecological perspective. I love this quote from William Clark's diary, July the 4th, 1804, during the Lewis and Clark expedition. They started that in 1804, got back in 1806. And this is when they were just starting, and they had just gotten to what is now present-day Donovan County, Kansas, the northeast corner of Kansas there, so just on the western edge of the present-day state of Missouri. And these are his exact words written in his exact spelling. So William Clark was a terrible speller, but a wonderful writer, okay? And if you read this, he says, the plains of this country are covered with elite green grass, well calculated for the sweetest and most nourishing hay, interspersed with copses of trees, spreading their lofty branches over pools, springs, and brooks of fine water. Groups of shrubs covered with the most delicious fruit are to be seen in every direction, and nature appears to have exerted herself to beautify the scenery by the variety of flowers delicately and highly flavored, rising above the grass. And then he goes on to say, far removed from the civilized world, look at the words he's using here, okay? Far removed from the civilized world, to be enjoyed by nothing but the buffalo, elk, deer, and bear, in which it abounds. And then he says the savage Indians, but I'm going to ask you, who are the savages here? Now, what he just described sounds like an Eden to me, and the Native Americans were living there. They had it pretty dang nice. You can't describe them as savages. So, when was William Clark born? This is the historical ecological perspective part of this. When was he born? In the 1770s, where? Virginia. 1770s in Virginia. So think about it. He was born in the 1700s, late 1700s, still a brand new country. It wasn't until he traveled that far west that he encountered something that struck him so profoundly. Abundance and diversity, so astounding that he wrote this. He had never seen this before in his life in the eastern half of this country, and we were still a brand new country. So by that point in time, by 1804, we had so devastated the eastern portion of the country of scenes like this that he had never encountered it before. That's historical ecological perspective, okay? So, and this is, in their party, this is a record of the amount of game they killed during their 2+ year expedition. And they rarely got very far off the rivers, right? So it was easy for them to harvest this amount of game to feed their exploration party. So it was just incredible, the abundance that existed at that point in time. I'm going to show you a short video here. This is one of our clients' ranches near Cimarron, New Mexico, so the northeast corner of New Mexico. They're regenerative ranchers, and what I'm going to show you here, okay, and then we're going to look at one more video, same ranch. All right. How many different species of ruminants, wild ruminants, do you see in those videos? You sure it's 3? Okay, at least 2. Anybody else? I've heard 2, I've heard at least 2, and I've heard 3. Anybody else? You win a book or a hat. 4? Okay, you get a book or a hat. All right. 4. Name them. elk, pronghorn antelope, mule deer. What typically also is out there with the mule deer? White-tailed deer. White-tailed deer. Okay? White-tail everywhere now, right? They're like rats. They're everywhere. All right. So what keystone species was missing? The bison. The bison. But they have cattle that are the proxy for the bison. Now, folks, we've got a wrong picture, historical, ecological perspective of what this continent was like with the bison, the elk, the antelope, and all of that. We think that the bison herds were just off by themselves, and they ran by themselves. They didn't associate, with anybody else, all of that. They didn't like their neighbors, so they just sort of stayed off by themselves. Not true at all. What did you see here? Did you see elk by themselves? Did you see deer or antelope by themselves? No. When we recreate a more natural, more functional ecosystem, this is what starts occurring. And we didn't force any of this. How could we force it? They do this on their own. They start to group up and gather together and move together again. So this continent once looked like the Serengeti in terms of the diversity of the animals that moved across it. That's what it was like. So they moved together, they associated with each other, and we also saw lots of ground nesting birds. Things like the wild turkeys that you see here, and quail and prairie chicken and partridge and sharp-tailed grouse and so on and so forth. So they all coexisted and depended on each other. And I love this quote. Who said it and when? Any idea? Nope. George Washington, 1796. Basically, what is he saying here? We've worn it out. We're a brand new country. We're not even in the 1800s yet. We have worn it out, worn our soils out. So everybody's trying to go west in search of new soil. So by the time we were a brand new country, we were already farmed out the soils. That's historical ecological perspective. Do you know that the vast majority of us today are not farming A horizon soil? We're farming B horizon. In a lot of places, there's no original A horizon left, and certainly not here in the South. Growing up in South Carolina in the Piedmont, red clay, I thought that was our soils growing up. So did my father, so did my grandfather. No, sir. More than a foot of original topsoil had long been in the Atlantic Ocean before they ever even bought the farm in 1840. It was already gone. The A horizon was already gone by that time. All right, we went over these in the first session, so I'm not going to take time to do that again. But context is the most important, and we pay attention to those because we want to optimize these, the 4 ecosystem processes. These are critically important: the water cycle, the mineral cycle, energy flow, which is photosynthetic activity, solar energy, and community dynamics, also called biological succession. So everything that we do is to maximize these. That's our goal. Protect the soil always. In the last session we talked about this. This is critically important. Protect it at all costs. You see here side-by-side fields, same time, same day, same air temperature. The field that had shading in it from forage growth and all of that, 87 degrees soil temperature. The next door field that had a lot of bare soil, 107 degrees. And as I said in the earlier session, we've recorded soil temperatures as high as 155 degrees for bare soil. It's too easy to get there. This is in Mississippi, May a couple of years ago. It was 85 degrees ambient temperature. This was a client that was brand new at the time, our first time on their ranch. They had been continuous grazers, just conventional grazers. And so very patchy, right? Very patchy. So just a pace away, okay? Air temperature 85, where the cattle had grazed down tight, the soil temp was 109 degrees. Where they had left the tuft of grass, the soil temperature was only 78 degrees. At 100 degrees soil temperature, you've lost 85% of your soil moisture, 85% of it. And your soil microbes have begun to shut down their activity. At 115 degrees, your microbes are breaking down heavily. At 140 degrees, you're killing your microbes. We're working with a lot of dairies in Michigan to transition them to regenerative. This is a 8,000 cow dairy here, and this was a couple of years ago, and that was the first year they had ever planted cover crops. So we started them with just simply doing a simple thing like planting cover crops, some cover crop mixes and that kind of thing. And so this is their first cover crop in one of their fields. The guy in the yellow shirt is the owner of the dairy, been a dairy farmer his entire life, so was his family, multiple generations back. The guy in the gray shirt is Kent Solberg, one of our Understanding Ag consultants. And I want you to pay attention here. You see differences in the field. They're standing in an area where the cover crop's growing pretty good, but you can see it gets thinner on some of the ridges. This was August, and they had had droughty conditions, okay? So the cover crop varied in its response. So you see where they're standing, then you see out on some of the knolls on the field where it got really hot and dry, then you see how thin some of this cover crop got, okay? And this was their very first attempt at this, and they had pretty bad soils to begin with. So here's the temperature difference. Air temp was 89 degrees. Where they were standing with the density of the cover crop, the soil temp was 79. Where the mower could not get at as the county was mowing the roadsides, it was 72 degrees, but where they had mown, and that would be similar to a freshly mown hay field, the soil temp was 117 degrees. Where you got out into the cover crop field where it was pretty thin, it was 118 degrees for kicks. We measured the temperature of the surface of the blacktop there, it was 118. So the mown road ditch, which is like a mown hay field, and the thin cover out in the middle of the field were essentially the same temperature as the darn blacktop. That's why it's important. This is why it's important to protect our soil, keep it covered in plenty of green, living, growing residue at all times. This was on that same dairy farm. This is under a corn that's under a center pivot. So they're irrigating it pretty heavily. Look at that pad on the top left. Tell me about it. Somebody tell me what you see there. Pretty solid. Does it look like I could throw it and hit you upside the head with you and knock you out? Okay. Yep. What else about it? Salts. Salt deposits, yes. Do you see any aggregation? That was as we dug it up right then and there that day. We didn't take it and put it in the microwave and dry it down. That was right then out in the field. He thought he had wonderful soil. And then, what do you see on the top right? More salt deposits. He's salinating his fields with his irrigation because he can't infiltrate. Look at the bottom there. That's where irrigation water was ponding and pooling because it couldn't infiltrate, creating moss growth on the soil surface and cracking, peeling. The soil is peeling. like you got a sunburn, and it's peeling. The soil has a sunburn. It's peeling. This is another problem that we're encountering. Research done in the state of Iowa. We're not going to get deep into that, but it's an issue. This is in Minnesota. I showed this video in the first session, but this is a Cold Springs, Minnesota, one of our dairies that's they're doing grazing every day in between the morning and evening milking. And so they move them multiple times a day to new paddocks, milking just under 100 cows and making an outstanding living on just under 100 cows. So they're doing quite well. You notice the calves by the side. We talked about that in the first session, the epigenetic benefit of those heifer calves being developed with the cows, even though this is a dairy herd. Hugely beneficial. I love this quote by Albert Einstein where he says, "No problem can be solved by the same consciousness that created it." Now, this doesn't mean that the same person cannot solve a problem they created, but it means they cannot solve that problem thinking the same way they were thinking when they created the problem. Okay? So they've got to change the way they're thinking about things. So what do we not want? Well, this. I can see way too much of this all through North America and anywhere in the world. Impact of grazing. This is not what we want to see. Okay? This is as detrimental to soil health and ecosystem health as tillage. As detrimental is tillage. And it causes you to have a heavy reliance on this, supplemental feedstuffs. Jerry, have you ever found a cheap supplemental feedstuff? As a matter of fact, typically if we put all true costs to it, what is our most expensive supplemental feedstuff? Hay. Who said that? You've already got a book. I'm sorry. You only win one time. Anything harvested, right. Hay can often be we think it's the cheapest, and it's the exact opposite. It's often the most expensive feedstuff that we can feed. How many people have heard of Andre Voisin? Okay, Voisin died in 1964, but he was a world-renowned French biochemist and farmer. Okay? That rare combination of academic and farmer. He was a keen observer. He wrote not just biochemistry textbooks that have been used in universities around the world, but he wrote grazing books that have been read by people around the world. And Andre Voisin noticed this. He said, overgrazing has little to do with the number of animals that were grazing, but rather far more to do with the amount of times plants were exposed to those animals. In other words, if animals remained in any one place too long or returned to it too soon, they overgrazed certain plants. And then he went on to say that one cow grazing on a 10-acre paddock all season can kill thousands of plants. This is called overgrazing while being understocked. But 1,000 cows grazing that same 10-acre paddock for a portion of a day will not kill a single plant. Rather, they will stimulate the latent seed bank and create far more diversity. Sort of goes against the grain of a lot of what we've been taught, doesn't it? Voisin figured this out a long time ago. He knew this back in the first half of the 1900s. So adaptive grazing. Just like I define regenerative agriculture, I'm going to define adaptive grazing. It is a form of grazing that allows us to be fully adaptable and flexible to ever-changing conditions. It produces the greatest results in the shortest period of time if you do it correctly. It does not reach a threshold. We have yet to find a threshold. We continue to make incremental progress, even after decades of doing it, and it allows us to achieve the highest levels of profitability. Here's the keys. It's goal-oriented. It's predicated on stock density, not stocking rate. Management and flexibility are key, as are frequent movement and frequent rest, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that rest part. Plant root system recovery. So I want to see not just the shoot part of the plant above the soil recover, but I want the roots to recover before I'm going back grazing again. And in many parts of the world, and here in the U.S., it's highly reliant on temporary fencing technology. Luckily today we have outstanding temporary fencing technologies, but we have clients with ranches that are in very rugged territory, and their ranches span anywhere from several 100,000 to over 1 million acres. So we've got clients that work on very large, rugged acreage. And it's difficult to span a lot of polywire in some of those situations. So what can we do there? What are we doing there to do effective adaptive grazing? Daily movement, herding. Jerry, you get a book or a hat. Herding. What do cowboys and cowgirls love to do? Sit astride a horse. You make them get off the horse and they're not happy, right? So we keep them happy. We let them sit on a horse all day long, okay? And guess what your livestock learn to do? They learn that. They learn daily placement. It actually gets pretty easy to place them. You go out there on horseback, move them to the new area, and they're like, oh, okay, that's where you want me to be today. And they graze in that area, and they learn herd instinct, herd behavior. They stay in a much tighter mob naturally. So your stock density is much higher naturally. Just like the bison that we're managing. We had to reteach bison natural herding instinct. They had lost that. So what we're trying to do is get a fully functioning carbon cycle. We do this by simulating nature. These pictures were taken in Africa, Tanzania. This is a wildebeest migration. We do this through what we call biomimicry and ecomimicry. So what does stock density look like? Here's a few examples. We've got 100,000 pounds per acre, 250,000, 500,000, and 1 million. Now pay attention to this next statement. We do ourselves all of these stock densities and many more some of the time, no one stock density all of the time. You got it? Don't pick, if you go away from here today and you say, well, Alan had a slide up that showed 100,000 pounds per acre. I'm going to go home today, and that's what I'm doing today, tomorrow, the next day, next year, next year. 100,000 pounds per acre. That's the secret. You just made a core mistake, and you will be neither adaptive nor regenerative. Okay? Do not pick a stock density and think that's the silver bullet. It is not. You've got to alter stock density. We're going to talk a lot more about that in a moment. There are reasons we do each of these stock densities and many more. There's a very specific reason I'll do 500,000 to 1 million or more pounds an acre, but I do it for very short duration, 20 minutes, 30 minutes in a single paddock and then moving them on. But I do that to rapidly build soil organic matter, soil carbon, fertility, and to tap the latent seed bank and to grow diversity in plant species. That's what I do those high densities for. Not for animal performance, okay? At those higher densities, you're not going to get great performance. But I can do it for short periods of time on select acres in any given year to produce profoundly positive biological and organic matter impacts. And this is how biologically powerful that is, that I can impact any one acre only once every 4 to 5 years like that, and that impact will last for years. It'll give me years of positive benefits. 20 minutes a day, folks. This is the power of biology. This is what we have to wrap our minds around. Biology is so powerful that 20 minutes a day at this kind of stock density, 20 to 30 minutes, once every 4 to 5 years, totally changes everything on that acre for the better. We've done it over and over and over again, and we've done it everywhere from this type of environment here in the South that's a very temperate, wet environment to true desert environments and everything in between. And it produces the same kind of powerful biological impact for the same length of time, whether I'm in the Chihuahuan Desert of Mexico or whether I'm on our farm in Alabama. It doesn't matter. So these are bison. This is a herd of 3,000 head of bison on the Standing Butte Ranch west of Pierre, South Dakota, managed under a single strand of polywire, moved every day. Bison, single strand of polywire, moved every day. We're doing this on multiple bison ranches now. It's making a profound difference in the health of the rangeland and the health of the bison. And the bison have relearned their natural herding instinct. And even without the polywire, what we're seeing now is a bison are moving themselves through these paddocks under much higher density. So the bison themselves are creating a high density impact, even outside of the polywire, because they have relearned their natural herding instinct. And as I showed in the earlier, when we can achieve stock density impact through multiple species of livestock, chickens, this is on our farm. We've got up to 8,000 laying hens at all times, and we run them across. They will trample every blade of grass and apply a lot of biology and fertility in a single day. So if I want to get a really high degree of trample, I'm going to use my chickens because they'll just flat out lay it down. So I love the chickens for this kind of impact. Again, these are some visitors. We have visitors every week at the farm. These are visitors from Louisiana there. Everybody loves the chickens, okay? When they go and they'll see the cattle, the sheep, the pigs, everything else, but when they get to them chickens, they want to hang right there with those chickens. So we filmed a documentary, and so this is at our farm, and this is some footage. You can see the cameraman in the background, and I call this, y'all know the movie Children of the Corn? I call this Chickens of the Corn, okay? But, so that's John. John's our poultry manager that you saw in the background there, the cameraman right beside him. That's my youngest son right there in the red cap. And, but, you know, the chickens love being on pasture. Absolutely love it and perform exceedingly well. This is a video. This is about 600 head of grass fats on our farm. So about a 600 head mob here. This is moving them into a new paddock. Now, one thing I want you to note here, though, is not just how easy it is to move them, single-stranded polywire, moving to a new paddock, but start looking at the skyline and all the birds. You'll see wood swallows, you'll see snowy egrets, and many other kind of birds. They follow the cattle every day. Follow them every day, eating the insects that the cattle store up. Our finishers typically get moved about 3 to 4 times a day, every day, to new paddocks. Again, just start paying attention to all the birds appearing against the skyline there as they continue to move into, you know, this new paddock. And so this is the typical density that we have a lot of our finishers at during that final finishing phase. And you saw the degree of marbling that we get managing them this way. I've already shown this one. I'm going to skip through that. Now we're going to finish up today with this, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. So in the first session, I gave you the 6 principles of soil health. Now I'm going to give you the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. By the way, now we have these at our booth, okay? And anybody can go by and pick one up. What is this? Okay. This is a conventional grazer's grazing stick. It's all they need. Okay? Sorry about that. But I just couldn't resist. All right, so the rule of compounding, rule of diversity, rule of disruption. No matter what you're grazing, no matter what species, these rules apply. All right, the rule of compounding. There are never any singular effects, ever. Doesn't happen in life. Everything that happens produces a compounding, cascading effect. Men, how many of you in here are married? Have you ever forgot your wife's birthday? Good, because if you had, that would produce a compounding, cascading effect that went on for the rest of your life. Okay? You can remember every other birthday she ever has, but she'll always remember and remind you about the one you forgot. Do you know how I know that? Yeah, that's how I know it. Okay, so even in our personal relationships, we don't have any singular effects. They're all compounding, cascading. And certainly out here in dealing with biology and nature, everything is compounding, cascading. So we got to think about that every day. If I do this, if I till, if I spray this herbicide, if I mow that hayfield, whatever I do, it's not producing a singular effect. Spraying a herbicide, you didn't just kill the target weed. You just did a whole lot of other things that are damaging. From the microbes in the soil to other plants to many other species. You just did you set off a series of compounding, cascading events when you sprayed that herbicide. And we got to think about that. What were they? So if we think about everything that we do, every management decision, every additive, everything we spray, whatever, is going to create a compounding, cascading effect. We ask ourselves, before we do it, are those compounding, cascading effects going to be positive or negative? Because here's the other thing about them. They're never neutral, ever. Compounding, there is no such thing as a neutral effect. They're either positive or they're negative. Okay? So, think about it every day, in everything that you do, every decision that you make. And guess what? Epigenetically, tomorrow, in my session tomorrow, we're going to dig deep. Part of what we're going to dig deep into is epigenetics. That has profound results on everything that happens on our farm, including our profitability. Positive and epigenetics are compounding. Epigenetics follow the rule of compounding. They're never singular, they're compounding in nature, and they're never neutral. They're either positive or they're negative. So if I'm producing negative epigenetic effects, it's going to negatively affect my profitability along with everything else. If I'm doing things that produce positive epigenetics, then we're doing something that's going to be highly profitable and make everything from the soil to the plants to the livestock far more productive and effective and efficient and resilient. Okay? This is an epigenetically sound cow. It's what she looks like after 6 straight years of significant drought, with this year being the most severe. This cow is located near Bismarck, North Dakota, Gabe Brown's farm. Okay? Does that cow look to you like she's been through 6 years of drought? So, epigenetically sound. That's what we want to produce. So that was the rule of compounding. Now we're going to intertwine all of this in just a moment. The second rule is the rule of diversity. We want highly diverse and complex pastures, and if we're planting annuals, highly diverse and complex annuals. Never a monoculture. I asked the question in the first session, I'm going to ask it again. Who is the only creature on the face of the earth that creates a monoculture? That's right, us. We're the guilty party. Nature, given her preference, always creates diversity, complexity, abundance. We're the only ones that reverse that, okay? We want diversity, and there's a multiplicity of reasons that we're diving into now. And we want all the functional groups, grasses, legumes, forbs, and yes, even woody and brushy species. We want them all because they all benefit us. So why diversity and complexity? Well, number one, it produces very positive compounding and cascading effects. So back to the first rule, the rule of compounding. Secondly, the work of Dr. Fred Provenza and others, it produces very positive secondary and tertiary compounds in our plants. And these secondary and tertiary compounds are phytonutrients that are medicinal and antiparasitic. So our livestock can medicate themselves daily, and they can deworm themselves daily. I asked the question in the first session, who deworms your deer? Nobody. They deworm themselves because they don't respect your fences. They eat a far more diverse diet than your livestock do. We're the reason our livestock can't eat a more diverse diet because we've been taught we've got to have these nice manicured pastures. We can't have any forbs or what most people call weeds, right? And all of that. So we have taken away our livestock's ability to self-deworm and self-medicate. When we have complexity and diversity in plant species, we also have diversity in the microbial species in the soil and diversity in macroorganisms, and the impacts are exponential rather than linear in nature. So these forbs, they're what we commonly call weeds. Define a weed. Define a weed. Plant out of place. What else? Okay, you were the first one, right? You get a book or a hat at the end. Okay. So I ask this every time I speak. I hear the same definitions anywhere we go. Doesn't matter what part of the world we're in, exact same definitions. So let me ask you this. Did any of you give me an objective definition? Did you? Nope. Every definition I heard was what? Subjective, right? Subjective, not objective. Can you major in weed science? Yep. Do we have weed science professors? Yep. Do we have weed science textbooks? Yep. But we have no definition of a weed. We can't define the very science that we can major in because there's no such thing as an objective definition of a weed. None. We individually, what's a weed in a cornfield? Anything but corn. The next year we got a corn bean rotation. We plant soybeans. What can grow up in those soybeans? Corn. Now what is a corn? Well, no, wait a minute. You just said it last year it wasn't a weed and everything else was a weed. Now next year you're telling me the corn's a weed. You get my point? There's no objective definition of a weed. Okay? Rather, what we need to ask ourselves, if there's any plant growing there that we define as a weed, why? Why is it there? What is the purpose of that plant growing there? In other words, what is nature trying to tell me? So, when do most of the plants that we call weeds grow? Tell me. What? Okay, when we spray something? Spring. Okay, and why? Why in the spring, Brad? Well, why doesn't the grass start growing before the weeds and outcompete the weeds and choke them out? By the way, you answer first, you get a book or a hat. Okay? Why? Okay. We've overgrazed everything else typically, right, through the winter, through last year, And these plants we call weeds are the plants that are going to grow most vigorously, but everything else is still in the seed bank. Are the grasses still in the seed bank? Are the legumes still in the seed bank? Well, why in the heck are the weeds growing there first? Okay, they are nature's cover crop. They are nature's first line of defense. They are nature's first healer. In other words, they're trying to tell us something. What is nature trying to tell me? What did I do wrong? Or I tilled or I did something, right? Okay. So I created the reason that that plant is growing there, right? You created the reason that plant is growing. Don't blame the plant. Point the finger back at yourself. You're the reason it's growing there, okay, through some type of prior mismanagement. And why is that plant growing there? Why didn't all the grass that's still in the seed bank and all the legumes that are still in the seed bank, why didn't they grow back rather than the weed? Okay, because we damaged the soil, we degraded the soil, and the weeds, nature knows what plant to grow there when, because the weeds are the plant that can most rapidly repair the damage we did. And tomorrow we're going to go into what a lot of different specific weeds, why they're growing when they're growing. Okay? They're growing there because nature is trying to repair it, but what's the first thing we want to do? Get rid of it, kill it. So the very plant that nature is putting there to help us, we're trying to destroy as rapidly as we can. So diversity is the key here. Let me show you what's in our seed bank at BDA Farm, okay? We have documented more than 140 different plant species growing in our pastures. And every one I have listed here, every one of them, our livestock eat. There's not a plant on that list they have not been documented eating, okay? So I want you to understand that. Now, we've got a lot of what you would call, quote, improved or tame grass stuff, right? You see the Bermuda grass, Dallas grass, fescue, da-da-da. But then look further down the list, what do you see? You see a lot of natives. We planted none of that. None of that. All of that is a result of our seed bank and our latent seed bank. We planted not a thing on that list, okay, since we've bought the farm. Not one thing. So it all resulted from the latent seed bank. So we built up to more than 140 different plant species now due to adaptive grazing, and they eat all of it. So we've got this incredible pharmacy out there now. That's our pharmacy for our livestock. It's unbelievable. They can treat any disease known to man with that pharmacy. And they can do it themselves when they know they have a problem. And they know long before I know when they have a problem. So we have this deep, rich pharmacy out there now. And by the way, that provides us with excellent year-round grazing. So we no longer have to worry about whether it's summer, whether it's winter, or whatever. We've got grazing in the same fields, same pastures, because we got something out of all of that mix growing, and dozens of something out of all of that mix growing year-round. We run 400 beehives. We have something flowering 12 months out of the year in that diversity. So our bees are able to forage 12 months out of the year out of their hives. So we manage for diversity and don't sweat the weeds. We don't care at all. Fred Provenza, landscapes with diverse arrays of plants are nutrition centers and pharmacies with vast arrays of phytochemicals. And this array is not only important for our livestock, and this is what we've also got to understand in our minds. It's important because that diversity is also feeding all of our life beneath the soil surface. It's feeding the plants, it's feeding the herbivores, the omnivores, the carnivores, the insects, everything. It's feeding all of that. So that diversity is allowing us to create and support highly diverse ecosystems with an incredible abundance of life. Isn't that what we all want? Isn't that what we want to see on our land? So that's what this allows to happen. And the health of our livestock improves dramatically when they can have much greater diversity to graze. They gain weight more efficiently. We have documented through eddy covariance flux tower technology placed out on the land. We have documented far less greenhouse gas emissions because of this diversity in the way that we're grazing now. So we can document, we can prove that we have far less green methane, nitrous oxide, carbon, so forth. So the covariance towers, the flux towers, allow us to document that. If you're a stocker operator, you want diversity in your pastures, your stocker calves will do far better with far less illness if you have diversity versus monoculture and low diversity pastures. Tannins, plants with condensed tannins. Now, why do I list some plants? And this is not a definitive list by any means, but why do I want plants with tannins? What's the importance of tannins? What? Worming. You get a book or a cat. Okay? Tannins are natural dewormers. So all of these plants that I have listed up here and many more are natural dewormers. Now, a lot of these you say, oh my God, I don't want those. Multiflora rose, are you kidding me? You know, mulberry, olive, cerisa, I don't think so. But they all are part of a broader mix, and they all contain powerful tannins that deworm our cattle. Now look at this. The nutritional composition of these plants we call weeds. How many of you have measured the nutritional composition of your tame grass species and your alfalfa? Now look at this. Compare that to this. All of these plants we say our livestock will starve on. Really? Look at this. Multiflora rose, 18% crude protein, 35 NDF. Okay? Black locust, honeysuckle, blackberry, greenbrier, trumpet creeper, privet hedge. Look at the nutritive value in those, folks. You just got to teach your livestock how to eat them, and they dang sure will. They will, under adaptive grazing. Look at this. Okay, crude protein and in vitro dry master digestibility measures. Pigweed, lamb's quarter, ragweed, smartweed, dock, henbit. Look at how powerfully nutritious these are. And we curse pigweed and ragweed. These were all measured at mid-stage maturity. So they weren't early stage growth. They were all at mid-stage. They were all basically right around boot stage, okay, getting ready to shoot out seed heads. Yep. So Russian olive. We've been told livestock won't eat Russian olive. Really? Look at that. Put them in, 4 hours later, got every leaf stripped. Very powerful nutritionally from a phytonutrient and medicinal standpoint. This video is one of the problems we have in the Black Belt Prairie is ash trees. They're constantly trying to grow. And this is on our farm in Alabama, and this is a patch of ash this year that had grown back up, and we're using our cattle to control them. As I show you this video, keep in mind that when we turned them in, this ash was so thick you could stand right beside it and not see through it, okay? I mean, just as dense and thick as it could be. So we put 1 million pounds per acre of some of our cows on here for just 30 minutes. So this is the cows moving into and through the ash and eating the ash, and they would take their heads, and some of these ash were 15 foot tall. They'd take their head and scoop it down and eat the leaves at the top and all of that. That's honey locusts, so they were eating the honey locusts. This is afterwards. Just 30 minutes, we could see clean through that. They had opened up that canopy so well that we had an explosion of grass growth in there for the rest of the summer. We did this in May of this year, and it grew incredible grass for the rest of the summer, where it was nothing but ash and bare ground under that ash before. So then the final rule, the rule of disruption. So we have the rule of compounding, the rule of diversity, and now the rule of disruption. Nature has tremendous resilience if we build it in her and responds well to challenges. So we need planned, purposeful disruptions to do this. How many of you have been athletes in here before? Okay. So, let's see, Jeremy Ing wasn't here. I think he's not in here. Jeremy was a wrestler. I was a wrestler in college. And so as an athlete, what do you have to do to progress? Okay, but how? If I want to get faster, stronger, gain endurance, what do I have to do? Okay, do I follow this? Right. Who said that? Okay. You've already got a reward. Do I follow the same exercise routine day in and day out? No, I have to alter it purposefully, right? I have to tear my body down and my mind down to build it back up. Are we biology? If that works on us, and does it work pretty darn effectively? You bet it does. So if it works for us, it works for all other biology. The biology out there on our farms and ranches, nature. So we have to introduce these planned, purposeful disruptions because nature, just like if I do the same exercise routine at the same duration and intensity day in and day out, what can I expect to happen? Right. I'm going to first hit a plateau, right? But then what's going to happen? Right. There's no stasis, guys, with us or nature. I'm 61 now. I guarantee you, I've lived long enough. There's no such thing as stasis, okay? I change every day. So all of us do. So does everything in nature. It changes every day. Nothing stays static. So just like us, we don't stay static, and if we don't keep exercising and challenging ourselves, we're going to first hit a plateau, and then we're going to digress instead of progress. Nature out there on our farms and ranches is exactly the same. We've got to alter it every day very purposefully to get it to change and to build and specifically grow resilience, okay? These planned, purposeful disruptions not only grow productivity, but they grow tremendous resilience. How many of you have experienced a significant weather challenge over the last 3 to 4 years? Raise your hands. Pretty much everybody, right? So have we. So what do we need? More than anything else, resilience. Planned, purposeful disruptions grow resilience. And they create a host. So back to the first rule, the rule of compounding. They create a host of positive compounding effects. That video right here, okay, that was a planned, purposeful disruption that created, so right there, planned, purposeful disruption and created a host of positive compounding effects. So how do we do this? How do we introduce planned, purposeful disruptions? First of all, do not do things the same way every time. Now, what is our nature, our tendency as a human? To do exactly the same thing every day, routine. We want a routine, don't we? You're a dairy farmer. How badly do dairy farmers want a routine? They're among the worst, right? On routine. Exactly. We crave routine. We've got to get out of that. And you know what? You'll find that once you break out of that, this is actually fun. I have no plans to retire because I'm having way too much fun. Okay? As long as the good Lord lets me, I'm going to keep doing this because this is the most fun I've had in my whole life. And I want to keep seeing what's going to happen. Okay? So remember this, regenerative management and adaptive management is not a routine, a recipe, a formula. The very moment you make it prescriptive, you make it formulaic, you turn it into a recipe, you have immediately become non-regenerative and non-adaptive, and you can no longer claim you are that. Okay? It's that simple, folks. It is really that simple. You can't prescribe regenerative and adaptive. You can't write a prescribed grazing plan for this. And the moment you try to do that, you are no longer that. All right? Truly is that simple. You don't need a prescribed plan. That is not necessary at all for one to accomplish this. As a matter of fact, it's a hindrance for you to accomplish this. So what are some of the ways we can be disruptive? This is a handful. It's not definitive. It's not every way that we can be disruptive, but it's some of the core ways we can be disruptive. Alter stock densities. We call it pulsing of stock densities. Remember what I said earlier when I showed you the different stock densities? Don't pick any one of them and do it all of the time. Purposefully alter stock densities. Okay? And do it routinely. Routinely alter stock densities. Do not move through the same rotations in the same pattern. Boy, how many of us have been guilty of that? We start off every spring in pasture A, and go to A, B, C, D, and E, and back to A, B, C, D, and E. In the next spring, start off in A again, A, B, C, D, and E. Folks, you'd be amazed. You change that. Start off in D next year instead of A. You'd be amazed at what profound differences that makes. Just that one little thing, that one little alteration. Because it changes everything about biology. And it changes cellular memory. Alter grazing heights on and off. This is why you always hit a ceiling with mid-grazing. One of the reasons. The next one is also a reason why you hit a ceiling with mid-grazing. You got to alter the grazing heights on and off, the maturity of the forages. You can't keep going on at the same stage of maturity. And you also have to alter the rest periods. You can't keep coming around every 30 days, every 45 days, every 60 days, like clockwork, year after year after year. You cannot do that, folks, and be adaptive and regenerative. You're going to hit a ceiling, you're going to hit a wall, you're going to quit making progress, and you're going to wonder why. It's because you just became non-adaptive. You turned the disruption into a prescription, okay? So rather what you've got to do, these two things, those two things together, the reason mid-grazing always hits a wall, and you start digressing after that. Because it's all about same height on and off and the same rest periods. Boom, 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 boom. When you do that, this is what happens to species diversity. It narrows, okay? When you alter those purposefully, this is what happens to species diversity. It broadens. That's what we're after. That's what we want to achieve. Alter species order. If you're like us and you graze multiple species of livestock, don't always graze them in the same order through. Alter time and season of the year a paddock is grazed. This is why BLM prescribed grazing, U.S. Forest Service prescribed grazing does not work. Because it's a terrible prescription. You're prescribed to do the exact same thing, same dates, same animal units, year in and year out. No matter the conditions. No matter the conditions. And that's why when we look at public lands, this is what's happening, not this. Okay? When you do the true analysis, and I've looked at them over and over again, you can see the symptoms very readily of the prescribed grazing. Alter paddock configuration. The shape of the paddock makes a profound difference. The shape of the paddock. If I want to have a high degree of trample in a short period of time with a lot of hoof action, a lot of biological impact, and a lot of manure and urine applied, what shape am I going to make that paddock? There you go, long and skinny. Long and skinny. You can have the same stock density on the same amount of acres and get a totally different impact if you make that paddock square versus long and narrow. Okay? You will not get the same biological impact in soil building impact. What matters, and you got to know when to make it what shape, okay? It's important. You got to know your goal. Planned burns can be a part of a planned purposeful disruption as well, but be very careful with that or any of these disruptions. Do not pick one or two of these disruptions and make them your disruption year in and year out. Again, you've become non-adaptive because you've just become prescriptive and you're repeating the same disruption over and over, and it's no longer a disruption, okay? Burns can either be a good friend of yours if you do them only very periodically, or they can destroy you. That's what's happening to the Flint Hills of Kansas right now. They're being destroyed and greatly diminished because burning the same rangeland year after year after year after year. We're seeing more Sarissa incursion, more Johnson grass incursion, more fescue incursion into the Flint Hills, and a great diminishing of the native tallgrass species that were there because of repeated burning. This is another thing that we want to see a lot of, the return of the dung beetles and the work that they can do for us. And I'm going to end with this. This is the best tool in your toolbox. Observation. I said it earlier, we encourage all of our folks at BDA Farm and our Ada Hills Farm in Mississippi to take time to observe every day. You need, on your farms, to take time to observe every day. That's one of the most important tasks, one of the most important jobs you have. Observe every day. Use all of your senses, sight, sound, smell, touch, and even taste. Yes, even taste. We go through and we graze through our pastures to see what everything's tasting like. Okay? You'd be amazed at how much that teaches you. It actually works. Observe the soil, plants, insects, birds, livestock. Everything that you see here, observe. Why? Because constant observation develops keen intuition. And when you develop keen intuition, you become far better decision makers. Every decision you make is now much better informed because you're making it off of far more observations. So you will inherently make better decisions. And then a handful of tools that are simple, easy, that you can use every day, every week to help you in observation. A shovel, we do what's called the shovel test frequently. Digging in the soil. Do we have aggregate? How deep is the aggregate? What does it look like? What's the aroma of the soil? What is our root depth? Do we see a lot of earthworms, other biological life? So a simple shovel test. A thermometer, we talked about measuring the temperature of the soil. A refractometer to measure plant bricks on a routine basis. And a water infiltration ring to see how well you're infiltrating or you're improving the water infiltration capacity of your soils. Those 4 tools, cheap, all of you can do it. You don't need to hire an expert, and you can do them routinely. If you implement those 4 tools on a routine basis on your own farms and ranches, you will make far better observations and you'll make really, really good progress in terms of what you're doing. All cheap, all easy to use. So tomorrow, for those of y'all that will be in that session, we're going to dive into a lot more detail on all of these things, and we're going to talk about the actual mechanics of how you do adaptive grazing, how to overcome challenges and issues and problems that you may experience, and all of those types of things. So we're going to get into genetics, epigenetics, and a lot of other topics, a lot of case studies. I'll cover a lot of case studies tomorrow as well. So You know, I'll end with this. How many of you are familiar with the late, great comedian Jerry Clower? Okay, so this is an old Jerry Clower story. It's called The Chauffeur and the Professor. Okay, and since I was once a professor, and I like Jerry Clower's professor story. So it goes like this. There was once a university professor he was a geologist. He was outstanding at giving speeches. And so this petroleum company heard him give a speech. And they thought it was so good, they wanted to hire this professor away from the university and put him out on the road giving this speech. So they enticed him with a big salary and hired him, and they said, we're gonna get you a limousine and a chauffeur to drive that limousine, and you're going to travel from city to city and university to university giving this speech. And that's what he did. And so 6 months into this professor had been going from city to city and university to university giving this speech. And one day they got just outside of the next city, and the chauffeur pulled the limousine over, and he turned back at the professor, and he looked at him, he said, "Now, professor," he said, "for 6 months now, I've been listening to you give this speech." And he said, "I believe I've heard it enough. I can give your speech every bit as good as you can." And the professor looked at him and he said, "You really think so?" He said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, we're going to find out." He said, "They don't know me at this university we're getting ready to go to. They never seen my picture." This back before internet and all that. So they never seen my picture. He said, "We're going to change clothes." He said, "I'm going to put on your chauffeur's uniform. You're going to put on my suit. And I'm going to drive you to this university. You're going to give that speech, and we're going to see just how good you can do." So they did that. They got to the university, and the president of the university got up and announced the chauffeur, thinking he was a professor, talking about what a profoundly knowledgeable fellow he was and all of that. And that chauffeur got up there, and I'm going to tell you now, he gave that speech every bit as good, maybe better than the professor could give it. And at the end, I mean, he had them rolling in the aisles. He had them standing and clapping and cheering. I mean, just, brought the house down. And then came question and answer time. So the university president said, "Well, anybody got any questions for the learned professor?" And so one of them PhD graduate students stood up, and he asked the professor the most complicated, complex question you ever heard in your life. And that chauffeur thought for a minute, and he looked out at that PhD student, and he said, "Son," he said, "that is the most simple question I've ever heard in my life." He said, "I'm disappointed that a student here at such a prestigious university could not ask a better question than that. And to show you how simple it was, I'm going to ask my chauffeur in the back of the room to answer it for me." So thank y'all so much.